Okay, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast, or IDDF, as we like to call it. I'm Benjamin Anthony, co-founder of the Miryam Institute, and I'm delighted to be hosted by my interlocutor, former Deputy National Security Advisor, Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, Chuck Freilich. He's the professor at Tel Aviv University, a professor at Columbia University, an erstwhile long-standing fellow at Harvard University, and he is also a fellow at the INSS here in Tel Aviv. It's really a pleasure to be with him. We're going to touch on a number of topics today. In addition to all of the accolades I just rattled off, Chuck is also now my occasional dining partner when I'm in Manhattan. Chuck, it was great to see you there and to have dinner with you. How did you enjoy our time together? Be honest.
I enjoyed it very much. I always do. I consider you one of my more interesting interlocutors and certainly one of the more eloquent ones. I always find your English an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Chuck. I appreciate those kind words. And of course, we went for dinner after I interviewed you for JBS in the studios there in Manhattan about your new book, which I want to really just mention to everybody as well. It's here. It's called Israel and the Cyber Threat. And the subtitle is How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. And we actually did a long form interview, about an hour in duration, fascinating deep dive into the subject and the topic. And I imagine that will be aired shortly. And thank you for putting your time aside for that. And I hope that people go out and purchase this.
Thanks for doing the interview. It was great.
It was my pleasure. So Chuck, we're going to run for about an hour, and I want to turn directly to the death of former head of Mossad Shabtai Shavit, who passed away at the age of 84 while on vacation in Italy. He served as the head of the Mossad from 1989 to 1996, a period that witnessed the signing of the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinians, a peace deal with Jordan, and the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Now, let's turn a little bit to the subject that has been of interest to successive Israeli prime ministers and also to successive heads of Mossad, and that is the nuclear weapons threat that emanates from Iran. And Shabtai Shavit had a particular take on this subject that I'd really love to dig into with you. In opposition to Prime Minister Netanyahu's viewpoint, and I want to emphasize he was not the head of the Mossad during Netanyahu's tenure, but of course the issue of Iran was very close to his heart and to his thoughts, as it is to Prime Minister Netanyahu. In opposition to Netanyahu's viewpoint, Shavit stated that Israel, quote, cannot practically prevent the Islamic Republic from developing nuclear weapons, but that Israel could deter them from using that capability. He believed also that Iran's pursuit of non-conventional weapons was a consequence of the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s, and that Iran emerged from that war very heavily traumatized, and as a consequence of that trauma, began the search not only for nuclear weapons, but also for ballistic, chemical, biological, and cyber capabilities. Now, two parts to my question here. The first is, I just interviewed you, as I mentioned, about your book, Israel and the Cyber Threat, in the JBS studios in Manhattan. How potent a force is Iran when it comes to the cyber realm? If you can just address yourself to that for a moment. I can't think of anyone better qualified to answer that question.
Well, let me just step back for a minute to the first part of what you were saying. It is important when discussing Iran, the nuclear program, cyber, whatever, to understand that Shavit was absolutely right in the sense that they emerged from the Iran-Iraq war, known as the 8-year war, deeply traumatized. Iran lost close to 500,000 people killed by the Iraqis. A similar number of Iraqis were killed. No one knows the precise number on either side. Now, Iran's population at the time, if I remember correctly, was 30-odd million. So 500,000 is, first of all, a significant percentage, but it is an open wound throughout Iran. And there are memorials, monuments, wherever one goes throughout Iran. To this day, it is a living trauma. Some people who have been say that it's somewhat akin to the way that Israel commemorates the Holocaust. And similarly to Israel, there was for the Iranians the sense of being totally isolated in the world, that their people are being slaughtered, including in repeated chemical attacks on Iranian cities, and no one in the world cared. And the American approach was, when Iranians and Iraqis are killing each other, they're not bothering us.
By the way, on that note, I believe that it was out of the Iran-Iraq war that former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, when asked to opine on that, on who he wanted to see gain the upper hand, retorted very wittily, "I wish the best of luck to both sides." Am I right?
Absolutely. So, I mean, Israel's approach was quite similar. They're keeping each other busy. They can't bother us. Unfortunately, they found other ways to do that. And I think Shabtai is similar to many other former officials, of former heads of Mossad, Tamir Pardo, and former chiefs of staffs, who said similar things. I mean, we can deter them. We can try and prevent them from going nuclear, but at this point, they have the knowledge. And so even a perfectly effective military strike that destroys every installation down to the ground will set them back by a few years, no more than that. And that's why we, maybe in the US, are moving towards containment rather than prevention. You asked about cyber. The nuclear program undoubtedly was deeply motivated by the Iran-Iraq war. The cyber program came along later. And talk about the law of unintended consequences. It was really Iran's decision to get into cyber in a significant way was the result of two events. One was the vast demonstrations that took place in 2009 after the presidential elections, when the regime threw the elections to Ahmadinejad, not to the guy who actually won. Iran has always held elections every 4 years. I wouldn't call them quite fair and free, but the guy who got the majority of the votes did win. That wasn't the case 2009. Huge demonstrations, which are fomented and sustained through social media and the internet as a whole. And that was a wake-up call for the regime that there is this thing called cyber out there. We should look at it. But the other thing, and here's what I'm saying, beware of the law of unintended consequences. It was even more deeply affected by the 2010 Stuxnet cyber attack, which is reportedly a joint Israeli-American attack on their nuclear program. It was a brilliant attack, both from a cyber and intelligence point of view. The two go together. You can't really do very much in the cyber realm without very strong intelligence. Sheer brilliance. There was one error, which in the end caused the thing to get out. And so the Iranians found out about it. But had that not happened, this might have derailed their entire program. As it is, it destroyed a good 1,000 centrifuges and put the program back by about a year. In any event, that was what really motivated Iran to get into cyber. And in the ensuing decade plus, they've moved up very rapidly. They went from essentially zero defensive and offensive capabilities in 2010 to already being on the offense by 2012. And today they are considered one of the most active actors in the cyber realm, certainly in terms of offense. But I would say that they're placed at the top of the second tier of cyber actors. So the top tier in this order is the US, China, Russia, UK, and Israel. We're in place number 4 or 5. I'll give the UK the credit. They are slightly bigger than we are.
Don't give the UK too much credit, Chuck.
Okay. Well, I have great respect for British capabilities. In any event, those are the top 5. And then there's the second tier, which includes Iran, North Korea, other countries. And Iran is pretty much at the top of that list today.
So I very much appreciate you giving us a bit of a bit more context about not only how Iran came to its pursuit of greater cyber capabilities and also its place within the hierarchy of cyber capabilities, sort of second division, top tier within that is how you seem to be describing it. There's much more that people can learn from you about that topic, and I'd encourage people to watch the interview on JBS when it's released. I actually want to turn to the second part of my question, which actually goes back to the nuclear issue. Now, Shabtai Shavit believed that the Iranians were not seeking nuclear weapons capabilities in order to use them. Now, here's where it's a little bit more defined, his opinion. We know about the ongoing debate of containment versus prevention, but he went a bit beyond that and said that the Iranians were not pursuing these nuclear weapons in order to use them, but rather to ensure that they gain and maintain immunity in the region. And in an interview to the Times of Israel that he sat down for some years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'll actually put a link to in the show notes here for anybody who wishes to read it, a very interesting interview carried out by the Times of Israel senior editor David Horowitz. He, Shabtai Shavit, says that Israel, quote, has to ensure that we have the capabilities so that if you, the Iranians, go out of your minds one day and want to use the bomb against us, take into account that Iran will cease to exist. The price you, and again, he's talking about the Iranians, the price you will have to pay if you want to utilize that capability against us will be prohibitive. Now, he's then asked the question whether or not he accepts that Iran will attain the bomb. And he responds with a yes. So what do you think about that? There's an interesting question that I have about this, which is I'm somebody who associates with the right of the political spectrum here in Israel. But as somebody who's on the right, I have been of the opinion, I seem to be a bit of an odd bird here, because I've been of the opinion for several years that the prognosis that Shabtai Shavit and others give about Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, namely that they will attain that capability, I think it's accurate. I unfortunately believe that Iran will have nuclear weapons capabilities in the near future, and yet that opinion seems to be something that's dismissed as almost a left-wing, weak opinion, that we need to be more prepared to confront this threat rather than to contain this threat. And yet you have security experts such as Shabtai Shavit, and as you said at the top of the program, many others of similar standing saying, look, we have to face the reality that attaining the bomb is likely the outcome of Iran's pursuit of the bomb. Why do you think this has become such a partisan issue when it comes to deciding whether one believes that nuclear weapons capabilities will be in the hands of Iran or not? Why is that? Why is that anything other than a cold assessment of the circumstances?
Well, unfortunately, I think everything in Israel has become partisan, and everything in the United States has, and it's very hard to conduct a rational and cold, hard assessment of issues. And of course, that's one of the reasons that we do this podcast, is to try and get beyond that and to present different positions, and right and left, and talk issues out. Let me step back for a minute to the trauma issue. So Iran has that trauma that we discussed before over the Iran-Iraq war, a horrifically bloody war. Iran has a long-standing, what should I call it? Fear of the United States, stemming from the toppling of the Mossadegh regime back in the 1950s, but more for the last few decades, where since the revolution in 1979, the United States has had a policy of containing Iran and regime change. There's congressional legislation from the early years saying that specifically the policy of the United States is to overthrow the Iranian regime. Not all presidents have pursued it, And we're now 44 years later, and I don't think anybody has a better idea of how that can be done today than they had at the time. But that was the official policy. And then the US comes along in 2001 and 2002 and topples two neighboring regimes, in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And President Bush at this time said explicitly that if things go well in Iraq, which they did not, Iran was next on the list. So any regime would be deeply scared when the United States is taking that kind of approach. But this is a regime which defines itself as the embodiment of the divine word on earth. Okay? The supreme leader, in effect, has a direct line to God himself. If you're trying to overthrow the regime, in effect, you're trying to overthrow God himself. And so that kind of regime takes this kind of a threat even more seriously. They were absolutely panicked at the time that they were next. Then comes Obama, and he's better because he's not talking overthrow, and he seems like a more moderate guy, but he imposes the most severe sanctions ever imposed on a country, at least as of that time, on Iran. And then Trump comes along, and he's viewed as a cowboy who might attack them. Then comes along Biden.
Just to clarify for our listeners, when you say he's viewed as, you mean through the Iranians' eyes,
right? Iranian eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
A loose cannon. I mean, you don't know what this guy's going to do. And then along comes Biden, who's again, like Obama, viewed as being more moderate, and he has eased the sanctions considerably. He hasn't lifted them, but he's eased. In practice, they're not really being enforced. But he hasn't backed off significantly of any of the positions regarding a New Deal. So they remain deeply, deeply afraid of the United States. As a matter of fact, the only existential threat that Iran faces comes from the United States, not Israel. Okay, we can cause them a lot of pain. We can't we can't overthrow the regime, and we can't hit them militarily in the way that the US does. Now, to get to your question. Look, Iran is already today a threshold state, nuclear threshold state. They have enough highly enriched fissile material, highly enriched uranium, for the first half a dozen bombs and around 10 by the end of this year. That's no longer a minimal arsenal, that's a small nuclear arsenal. And it's 10 by the end of this year, and there'll be 20 or whatever at the end of next year. The only good news here is that they have chosen not to go the last mile, which is weaponization, which is developing the warhead that you put on a missile to deliver the nuclear weapon. They've been in that position for the last 20-odd years. So this is clearly a political decision and a fear on their part that going this last step would be a bridge too far and might invite the American and/or Israeli attack that they don't want, and the threat to the regime that they really don't want. But in effect, I mean, it's up to them now at this point. They can cross the threshold whenever they want. Yeah, it could take a year or two, assuming that our intelligence is correct. It may be less. And the only way that could be stopped would either be massive international diplomatic and economic pressure, which would get them to back off, or a military strike, which, as I said before, even in the best of circumstances, cannot achieve more than a few-year outcome. Which is why if Iran wants to cross the threshold eventually, they will do so at a time of their choosing. It's a political decision. And the prospects of anybody attacking them are even poorer today than they were till now. Biden is actually the fifth or sixth president in a row. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, now Biden. Yeah, so it's fifth president in a row who has refused to take military action. I don't see that changing. It doesn't seem to be in the American interest. Israel's capability is limited, and there's, of course, we're now in the midst of the judicial disarray, which has undermined Israel's military capabilities, at least for a while. You're saying you're presenting one part of the picture, I would say one school of thought. I divide the way the Israeli defense establishment or the political establishment view the Iranian nuclear issue into two schools for analytical purposes. These schools don't exist, it's my analysis. One school says that a nuclear Iran is absolutely an existential danger to Israel. If they get the bomb, they'll use it. Maybe not immediately, but at the timing of their choosing, they will use it. Now, if that is your approach, it's an existential threat in the purest sense of the word, then Israel must do everything in its power to prevent it. Must do everything in its power, because no matter how severe the consequences may be, it's better than losing national survival. A second school of thought, I would say this is the slightly more moderate one, says, look, nobody can deny that possibility. They may decide to use it. The chances are really, really low, because I wasn't familiar with the Shabtai Shavit quote that you quoted before, him saying that it will lead to their destruction. But I think it's pretty clear to anyone who looks at the whole picture. Israel has great, when we get our act together again, we have great military capabilities, and the entire world thinks that we're a nuclear power and have been a far more significant nuclear power for a few decades now, with an internationally guesstimated arsenal of, let's say, 100 nuclear weapons. That's why, yes, I mean, if they have a trauma over the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, here we're talking a war which might last 8 minutes, and just Metro Tehran is 10 million people. The country as a whole is 80-something million. How many people is Iran willing to lose in order for the divine joy, for the sublime pleasure of wiping us off the face of the earth? Now, if you ask me 10,000, I'd say yes. If you say 20,000, yes. 100,000, 500,000, remember their trauma over the Iran war. 1 million, 2 million, where's the cutoff point? This sounds like total insanity. And I think anyone who has followed the Islamic regime since its inception understands that they may look like a bunch of Michiganers on the outside. And there's no doubt that they are extremists, that they are radicals, but they also go about pursuing their objectives in a very carefully calculated manner, in a rational manner. Again, it may not be rational to want to destroy Israel, but the way their policy that is directed to that is very carefully calculated. And that's why people in the second school of thought say that this is really for deterrent purposes and for purposes of buying what you said before, impunity, so that nobody can destroy the regime, especially the US, but to deter Israel from a major attack, and that they probably won't use it. Now here, I'm answering at length, so let me just add one more or two sentences. What really is at the heart of the difference between these two schools of thought is really the question of rationality. Is Iran a rational actor? The second school says, well, of course we could be wrong, and so we have to do everything we can to prevent Iran from going nuclear, and it would be a dire change for the worse if they do. But in all likelihood, to the extent that we can analyze and forecast things, they're going to use it for deterrence purposes to buy impunity. They will never actually use it because it would be national suicide. And the people in the first and the harder line camp say that if Iran gets it, they will use it. To the best of my knowledge, that's really a minority view.
So you've said so much there, and I'm very pleased that you've given such a long form response to that. Let me give some thoughts in reply, if I may. The first one is that you mentioned that this is a political decision. Now, you focused on the Americans and the successive presidents who demurred from the idea of militarily attacking Iran's nuclear capabilities, but I actually believe that within this patent that Prime Minister Netanyahu regularly reiterates, which is crippling sanctions or biting sanctions, or however one wants to describe those sanctions must be accompanied by what he terms a credible military threat. Now, a credible military threat is not bound only by military capabilities. To come back to your point, it also has to be bound by whether or not there is the political will. And I don't believe, and this is actually the reason that I don't believe that Israel will prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapons capability. I don't believe that there exists the political will for a strike against those facilities within the state of Israel. Now, I do believe that if tasked with finding a military solution or resolution to the Iranian nuclear threat, I do believe that the Israel Defense Forces and our defense establishment is capable of genius and capable of basically converting the impossible to the possible. I think about the raid on Iran's nuclear archive. I think about previous escapades by the Mossad, and I have strong faith in that, but I do not have faith in the political will. And I'll tell you that there was a particular moment where I jumped off the idea that there would be the will to bring about a serious, focused military attack against Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities. And that was when former Prime Minister and at the time Defense Minister Ehud Barak departed political life. Now, that was in 2013, and you might remember that there was a very, very strong move toward the idea that we were going to strike against Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, and there was a standoff. There was a standoff between Prime Minister Netanyahu and, at the time, the head of the Mossad, which I believe was Meir Dagan, if I remember correctly, and even the chief of staff, which was Gabi Ashkenazi at that time,
and the head of the Shin Bet, the entire
the entire crew, except for one guy, this figure Ehud Barak, who was said to be very much in lockstep with the idea that actually a strike should be carried out against Iran's nuclear capabilities. And I believe that when ultimately it came to pass that Israel decided against that strike, I believe that Barak felt that the opportunity to have a legacy issue, namely being the defense minister at the time that Israel dispatched this threatening program, I believe that he saw that that had now moved beyond his grasp, and he therefore retired from political life. That's one point, and I do believe that it was an indicator of the fact that Israel lacked the political will and still lacks the political will to do that. Now, with that having been said, taking the rational act or irrational act or idea a couple of steps further, look, we have the situation where, yes, Iran is pursuing its goals with regard to the states of Israel and indeed regional hegemony in a manner that is deemed by many, many analysts to be deeply, deeply rational and very, very calculated. However, that does not in any way reconcile with the rhetoric, the speeches, the writings coming out of the regime over there. And I think that it would be reasonable to look at Iran's sequence of developments and its efforts and everything that it's doing in pursuit of its ideological and religious goals as being rational up until the point that they decide to do the inherently irrational. And a strike against Israel, a nuclear strike against Israel, Chuck, does not have to be launched from Tehran over to Israeli territory. The problem that we have with Iran is that they have so many non-state actors under their command, including hot on the border of the state of Israel, not only in southern Lebanon, but also in Syria today, that nuclear-tipped capabilities could be sent to Hezbollah operatives, launched against the states of Israel. Iran would receive a degree of immunity, presumably, because those strikes would be launched not by Iran, a state, but by a non-state actor inside southern Lebanon. And so they have that luxury and that room for maneuver that I don't think people are sufficiently focused upon. Here we have a fighting force, a potent fighting force in southern Lebanon called Hezbollah, which has the military might that is superior to most of Europe's militaries today. they do not have any real accountability when it comes to the international community, and they have at any given moment somewhere between 110 and 150,000 rockets and projectiles aimed towards the state of Israel that gives them the ability to cover all of the states of Israel in its entirety and to overwhelm our air defense systems. You add to that nuclear weapons capabilities, then you really have a problem. And not only do you have a problem in the terms of a nuclear strike being launched against Israel, but you also have this terrible, terrible pressure that would prevent Israel from freedom of maneuver in the case of a conflict with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's one thing for us to be able to push back against these rocket threats as and when they emerge. We've done that for more than 50 days in some of our more recent conflicts. We've managed to resist pressure from American administrations who have asked us to bring a halt to the gunfire. That in and of itself is a series of considerations that Israel has to conjure with at any given time. Imagine a scenario where it's not the Americans who are saying, listen, Israeli Prime Minister so-and-so, you have to pull back here from the Gaza Strip, but actually it's Iran saying, listen, you stop this right now, or you are going to face the consequence of non-conventional weapons heading your way, not by us necessarily, but by our proxies over there in Lebanon and Syria. What do you think about that?
Well, you've said a great deal. Let me try and respond to a number of the points. Look, first of all, I agree with you that even if you want to go the diplomatic route, as I prefer, if we can, the diplomacy and sanctions, it should be backed up by a credible military threat. That's critical. Diplomacy works best, national security life works best when there's a combination of both carrots and sticks. You can't just hit people over the head all the time with sticks. You have to offer carrots, but carrots alone also need some initiative, some incentive behind them, such as a stick. And I think today the problem is neither Israel nor the US has a credible military threat. The US, not because it couldn't if it wanted to, but because the message that's emanating from Washington for many years now, Biden, Trump, I would say, paradoxically, Obama was the only one who had a little bit of a credible military threat. And Israel's got a problem, is that even before the current dysfunction, and maybe I should use a stronger word, due to the judicial overhaul crisis, there were really objective doubts whether what we can do. We can hit Iran. We can cause them a lot of damage, a lot of pain, but at best we can set them back for a few years. And so we're trying, or at least until the judicial overhaul, we were trying to rebuild a credible threat to do that. I don't know of any expert in the world who thinks that we can do the impossible in this case. It would be nice to think so. We have done remarkable things over the years, but I don't think that's the case here.
Chuck, I just want to interject there and bring one expert to the table. So as you know, I sat down and I interviewed Yossi Cohen recently, also a former head of the Mossad. I interviewed him in March of this year, I believe it was, in Manhattan, twice. And Yossi Cohen is an expert, and Yossi Cohen stated publicly and also to me privately that he does believe that Israel has the military capability, and he even said without doubt, without a question, if the political will is there, to severely impede Iran's nuclear weapons pursuit. So that is a serious expert who is voicing a very serious opinion from a position of exceptional qualification, or being exceptionally well qualified to do. So I just want to add that to what you're saying.
That's a very important point. And you can add to that the statement by the current head of Mossad, David Barnea, who said publicly, and I think this was a mistake on his part, but he said publicly that the Mossad promises the people of Israel that Iran will not go nuclear. Look, the question is, when Yossi Cohen says severely impede, what does that mean? Is 3 years a serious impediment? I would say yes. I don't believe that he thinks that we can destroy the program and prevent it from being reconstituted. But okay, he's the head of Mossad. I won't argue with him. Let me make that point. I don't think that he's talking about anything more than a few years. And I think, like I said, Bonaire should not have said what he did. I tend to think, this is my own personal assessment, and I've been out of government for a long time, so I can express an opinion here. I wouldn't if I had left recently. I do think that in the final analysis, or at the if and when the crunch comes and Iran is about to cross the threshold, I think we will attack. And I don't think we'll achieve a great deal. And I think we will pay a very, very heavy price for this attack. But I think we have no choice but to do it, and simply cannot allow Iran to cross the threshold, pretty much no matter what the price. And I mean, this is a whole separate discussion, what the consequences are. We will be hit very, very hard. The international community will respond very harshly. I don't know what this will do to the relations with the US. There are some critical questions here, but I still believe that that's the case. Barak, to the best of my understanding, did not favor a military strike at the end. There was a 2-year period from 2010 to 2012 when he and Netanyahu did bring, I believe, 3 proposals to the cabinet to launch an attack. And there was a united front of the defense establishment. Some of the ministers, yes, some no. But all of the defense chiefs said no. We don't know precisely what their considerations were, but I believe they fell into 2 realms, the primary ones. One was the question of operational feasibility, or more correctly, what could actually be achieved here. And we can hit them. The question is what we'd actually achieve. And secondly, the American response. And had the American position not been so opposed, then maybe they would have supported the entire operation. And my understanding is that towards the end, by the end of 2012, Barak had changed his opinion and he had backed off also. I believe that we have to take Iranian rhetoric very seriously. We learn to take Arab rhetoric very seriously. Their culture is such that they speak in somewhat different terms than we do. To our ears, it sounds highly inflated and not entirely credible, but I believe it is. When they say they want to destroy Israel, they mean it. Take into account, by the way, that if you were an analyst sitting in Tehran and listening to Israeli rhetoric today, you might find some of it pretty concerning also. I think we've, in some ways, become too integrated in the region. And this is an example. You raised the question of whether Iran could hit Israel indirectly with nuclear weapons by a proxy. In this case, it would be Hezbollah. There's nobody else out there with even the potential capabilities. I actually wrote an entire study a good dozen years ago about the threat of nuclear terrorism to Israel. I believe it's still the most comprehensive study on the issue. It's very, very hard to transfer that kind of capability to a non-state actor like Hezbollah. I mean, how are they going to deliver it? Yeah, they could do it by missiles, or they could by truck just coming up to the border. We have them, I mean, they are very deeply penetrated by Israel from an intelligence perspective. Can they provide them with the weapon without our knowing? And does Hezbollah really have the capability to deliver it? Let's say they do have the capability. And then, of course, it's a real nightmare scenario for 2 reasons. One is they're right on the border. It's a short-range rocket. They can hit us from that point of view easily. And what are we going to do? Respond and where? Or let's say even before they use it, we find out they have it. What are we going to do? So we'll try and bomb the position, maybe, if we know where it is. And if we don't, what can we do? My approach, my recommendation there was quite simply, if we're hit by a nuclear weapon, we don't ask questions. First, we respond against Iran. Then we'll try and find out who actually did it.
Well, a few points about that. It strikes me that the country here that holds the strongest, most credible military threat in this whole scenario actually is Iran. The fact of the matter is that the credible military threat of Hezbollah does act as a restraining force on the Israeli maneuverability now, not just with regard to Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, but also when it comes to our movement in southern Lebanon, in Syria, and indeed in the Gaza Strip. I recently interviewed, I don't know if it's been published yet, but I recently interviewed the former deputy head of the Mossad, Naftali Granot, about the idea of a multi-front conflagration and Hezbollah's role within that. Now, he actually is of the opinion that a multi-front war is not in the cards in the immediate term, but something incidentally that I found very, very curious, and I was surprised to hear from him and to read from him. But I think that when it comes to looking for credible military threats with regard to Iran and Israel and the United States, the most credible one seems to be in the hands of Iran by way of the proxy. The second thing that I would say is that, of course, we're very much active in the prevention of material coming from Iran into Lebanon, but it's still getting through. We're running strikes over Syria regularly and often, even daily. We have a deconfliction scenario that we regularly implement with regard to the Russians who are ensconced there in the area. But still, I wouldn't want to take a chance on the idea that we have a hermetic seal against such capabilities being brought to our border. And it sounds to me that neither would you. And and we have the very same, we see the progress of Iran in particular when it comes to their entrenchment in southern Syria now. There is a much larger presence in southern Syria than there was in previous years. It's not, by the way, commonly spoken about, but make no mistake about it, our listeners, I say that too, that is going to come to the fore sooner or later, probably sooner. Now, on the issue of hitting the capabilities of Iran and knocking them back by just a couple of years that you mentioned, you estimate about 3 years in what you said earlier. I want to bring a quote that's interesting. It's somewhat adjacent to the issue, and it's again from Shabtai Shavit, the recently passed former head of the Mossad, and he was talking about a potential deal with Syria that would have involved Israel returning the Golan Heights to Syrian sovereignty. And he's asked the question during this interview as to whether or not returning the Golan Heights would have been very dangerous. And the interviewer, again, David Horowitz of the Times of Israel, said, "We'd have left the Golan, and who knows what would have happened given the horrors that have unfolded there under Assad's son, Bashar." And he's referring there, David Horowitz, to the civil war that unraveled the entire country there. And Shabtai Shavit responds with the following statement. He says, "That was in 1993. We're in 2020. This is all hypothetical. To say we would have lost out from such a deal is not relevant. If you don't take risks, you get nowhere." Now, that's a very, very interesting statement in the context of hitting Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, because I believe that in this region, the Middle East, 3 years can turn into 3 decades and even more. Who knows how things will evolve? Who knows if Iran will automatically hit the reset button on its nuclear weapons program and start to rebuild anew and reconstitute the expertise and the facilities? One never knows what can happen in 3 years, as is evinced by the Abraham Accords and now even this discussion about Saudi-Israel normalization. Don't you agree?
Yes.
Great.
But look, you're absolutely right. 3 years can turn into 30. We have to assume, or at least take into account, the worst case scenario. And that's actually potentially even less than 3 years. Now, I've always believed that if one is going to go in once, attack once, there has to be a willingness to do so a second and theoretically even a third time. The US can do that. Be very, very, very hard for Israel to do so. Remember, I mean, even the first attack is at the absolute outer limits of Israel's military capabilities. Iran is far away from us. We're not a global superpower like the US. The IDF is built to handle threats on the border and maybe a couple of 100 miles beyond the border, but not at the distances that Iran is. I also believe that if and when Israel attacks, the objective isn't so much the direct military destruction that we're going to cause. That's, of course, part of it. But it's basically to create a situation where, under a threat of another Israeli attack, because the international community will view that as a major threat to regional stability, under that pressure, then maybe it's really it's a military move designed for diplomatic purposes to get the international community, meaning under American leadership, to really get serious about Iran and impose the kind of truly crippling sanctions, total isolation that Iran has never been subjected to until now. You were talking about Iran having greater credibility today than the US or Israel. You may be right. But credibility is also very much a question of where you're looking at things. Again, we look at Iran as being this very, very powerful and very, very hostile state, which it is. But look at things from Tehran. And actually, Israel is, or was until the current judicial crisis, it's the strongest power in the region by far. Iran's conventional capabilities are very limited. And yes, they've developed some rocket and missile, ballistic missile, cruise missile, drone capability to hit us directly. Their primary means of hitting us is Hezbollah. Yes, they can cause us a lot of pain. We can probably cause them greater destruction. Maybe it won't be against the population, but we can hit regime targets, we can hit their infrastructure, we can do all sorts of really, really severe things that will hurt them very badly. From an intelligence point of view, Iran appears to be totally penetrated. Okay, you discussed you mentioned the stealing, what was it, of the nuclear
of the nuclear archive.
The nuclear archive. Can you imagine, you're now looking at it from an Iranian perspective, they hide this stuff in a totally nondescript warehouse in the heart of Tehran, the least imposing place they can find, put it in very thick safes, and Israel comes along one night and steals pretty much the whole thing. They look at the Stuxnet attack that I mentioned before, arguably the greatest, I think it is the greatest offensive cyber attack to date, and the stealing of the nuclear arsenal, the nuclear archive will undoubtedly go down in history as one of the greatest intelligence coups of all time. And we assassinated the head of their nuclear program, Fakhrizadeh, and other nuclear scientists. There's the US in the background. Today, maybe it's a sleeping giant, but giants are awakened at times. And we signed the Abraham Accords, which, if we were not in the process of totally screwing up by our own hands today, would have had them surrounded. They and the Saudis, who have not yet come out publicly, but in practice there's a lot of cooperation with them, we'd have had them surrounded. And they're surrounded by American forces. And Israel is doing what it wants in Syria and attacking their forces time after time after time. So I think things at the moment look better from Tehran than they have been in recent years, but their fears are very, very deep. And I'm not sure how convinced they are of who's got the greater credibility. And a final comment that you talked about the Golan. Look, here I have to acknowledge, I think, one of many, but maybe the biggest mistake that I think I've made over the years. I was very supportive of the peace talks with the Syrians, and I was one of those. I was in good company, the chief of staff at the time, who believed, and Rabin, who believed that in exchange for a real peace agreement, and Israel was insisting that they sign on to every possible detail of what normalization would look like and very detailed security arrangements. In exchange, we could withdraw from the Golan. The chief of staff at the time, Lipkin Shachak, said publicly in an interview, said, look, if you're asking me from a pure security perspective, do I prefer to have the Golan or not to have the Golan? Yes, I prefer to have the Golan. He said, now you're asking me in exchange for peace, do I believe that we can find workable security arrangements and it's worth doing? The answer to that is also yes. And so I took that approach as well. The people on the right at the time used, I think, a very appropriate, even very forward-looking slogan. They said to sign a peace agreement with Syria is like signing on an ice cube. And what does that mean? Well, the regime is here today, gone tomorrow. And I thought that they're talking pure nonsense. I mean, what kind of talk is that? The Assad regime had already been in power for 30 years. There was no danger to it. If you sign with, actually, the Syrians have proven that they live up to their word. They signed the disengagement in 74. They've always adhered to it. Well, along comes the Arab Spring, a decade later, and Bashar Assad is almost toppled, and we're now in the Syrian case, 22 years later, and he's in no danger of being toppled at this point, but the civil war is not over. So in this case, I think the right was right. On the other hand, Shabtai was raising an interesting question, which was, lo l'olam chosen. I mean, how long do we, I mean, even if you come to the conclusion, as I did, that I was wrong at the time, let's say, for argument's sake, that tomorrow there's some magnificent new regime in Syria that wants to make peace with us. We're going to say, it really wants to make peace, not Assad, who was swallowing hard, who would have held his nose and somehow agreed to the bare minimum of an agreement with us. Somebody who really wants peace. Who would have believed that the president of Egypt would come to Israel and sign a peace agreement? That maybe Jordan Moore people would have believed, but who would have believed that the Abraham Accords would happen? I don't see any of this happening in Syria for a long time, but suppose it does. Are we going to say no then also? Not clear to me.
Well, I appreciate you providing your perspective as always, and this comes to one of our fundamental differences with regard to policy and with regard to diplomacy and even beyond. My response in direct reply to your question, which may have been a rhetorical question, my response would be yes. My response would be yes, we refuse to withdraw from the Golan Heights. My fundamental view on this is that the idea of concessions of land in the pursuit of peace is a flawed concept, and it should be a concept that listen, Chuck, this is a concept that has a very, very clear history in its wake, a very clear history with very real consequences. Now, I know that you'll probably point to Israel's treaty with Egypt, and you'll say, listen, we withdrew from the Sinai, and as a result of withdrawing from the Sinai, we have a very durable peace with Egypt. It's even endured during the brief but significant and very wearisome rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, just following the Arab Spring. But I believe that that's the exception that proves the rule. If you look at the Gaza Strip, if you look at southern Lebanon, anywhere that Israel withdraws from, we have terror raining down upon us. And I believe, quite frankly, I don't want to speak about it for too long, but I believe, quite frankly and quite simply, that peace should be provided in return for peace. It should not be provided in return for land concessions and the endangering of our citizenry and of our soldiers and of our country entire. I think that a very real reason for people's optimism with regard to the Abraham Accords was precisely that they were predicated not upon land concessions, but normalization for normalization. And that is the method, and that would be the rule that I would like to see replicated in the event that we have any future peace agreements or normalization agreements, indeed, with any of our immediate neighbors or neighbors in the region. Now, I don't want to harp on about that for too long because it's a separate conversation. And frankly, I could end up talking about that with you and you with me for several hours. But I did want to provide that very clear answer to your question. My answer would be yes to your question. Would we say no? I say yes. I would say no. And of course, I'm far from alone in that view. Now, I want to turn to one other quick topic that we can speak about, and that is the huddle that took place. And I'd really love to get you to weigh in on this, Chuck. There was a huddle that took place last month between Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanegbi, the director or head of the Mossad, David Barnea, and the chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Herzi Halevi. And that huddle focused on the security questions as they relate and pertain to Riyadh's demand for a US-backed civil nuclear program on Saudi soil. Now, you in previous editions of the IDDF podcast, you have highlighted that a civilian nuclear program in the hands of the Saudis could be reconfigured for military purposes and also spark a regional arms race. You and I have discussed that, and that's obviously something that would jeopardize severely Israel's security. I just want you to weigh in on this because Tzachi Hanegbi is the current national security advisor. Here in this conversation, I'm joined by a former deputy national security advisor. What are the assessments that you think, just a few of the points, that you think are being made at meetings such as this?
Okay, before I answer that, let me just go back to the previous point very briefly. As always, you make some very good arguments, and I cannot say that you're wrong. Returning land for peace, given Israel's dimensions, is at best problematic, and some people would say a lot worse than that. It's certainly dangerous. And you may be right that, I mean, Egypt was a one-time exception. I would differentiate between the West Bank and the Golan in the sense that the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, we have historic and religious ties to. And of course, the biblical story takes place there, not in Tel Aviv, which didn't exist. And if there's a reason for having a reborn Jewish state, obviously it would take place more there than anywhere else. The Golan is something that we never controlled. It was never, I don't want to say never because the borders changed historically, but it wasn't part of biblical Israel, and we never had an attachment to the Golan. We took it in 1967 for purely military reasons. And so if we can reach a deal which is real peace, then I wouldn't discount the possibility completely. You're absolutely right that the withdrawal from Gaza and from Lebanon, well, it didn't produce the rocket fire or terrorism. It was ongoing way before that, but it certainly didn't put an end to it. And the withdrawal from the West Bank may not do that either. So that's and also it's at Israel's narrow waist. That's a much more dangerous proposition. In any event, the problem is, of course, is that when you take that approach, you are setting our fate to be in a state of eternal conflict. That may be the case in any event, but that basically sets the course. There isn't much alternatives because I think the Abraham Accords was a one-off also in the sense that it was peace for peace without anything significant on the Palestinian issue. I don't think the Saudis can go ahead without getting some significant concession, but go ahead.
Well, you've drawn a distinction there between a withdrawal from the Golan Heights and a withdrawal from Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. Let me draw a similarity to everybody's attention. We would be establishing, in the case of a withdrawal from Judea and Samaria, we would be establishing a state for the Palestinian Arabs in similar fashion to the threat that we've had to our north that would be situated at a dramatic topographical advantage, overlooking the lowlands of the state of Israel. And not only would it have that topographical advantage, but unlike Syria, I would argue more dangerously and with far greater danger than Syria, in the event that that putative Palestinian state would fail, which I believe it would because of its landlocked nature and the lack of natural resources. And I know that people say, well, Israel became the startup nation. Surely this new Palestinian Arab state would do the same. I don't see any evidence for that being the case. There's no reason to believe that that would happen. But in the event that, pardon me, Chuck?
I agree.
Yeah, so in the event that that state fails, which I believe it would, you would have a corridor, a land corridor that would stretch from Iraq to Iran to Afghanistan to Iraq to Jordan, and then all the way over to this failed Palestinian Arab state, looking down upon the state of Israel. So just on the security aspects, and listen, territory still matters, topography still matters. People may like to believe that it doesn't. It does matter. Just on that front alone, I would say that the answer to a request for land concessions in Judea and Samaria, in addition, certainly to Israel's historic rights to be there, the origin story of the Jewish people emanating from there, in addition to all of that, the view of the state of Israel, in my opinion, what I want to see from Israel's leaders is to, quite frankly, take a leaf out of the Arabs' books and say, no, 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 if peace is to be predicated upon territorial withdrawals that put the Jewish state in its entirety in a very, very treacherous position. Indeed, that would be what I would term a Pyrrhic peace, and it's a price, in my opinion, not worth paying. There are other solutions that we can talk about. We won't do it on this particular program, but I just wanted to draw a similarity in response to your distinction.
Okay. All good points. Those threats or those dangers are obviously there. Let me get back to your question about the meeting between the defense chiefs about the question. The deal, the purported deal for normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, most of the concessions that the Saudis want are directed at the U.S. Yes, they want concessions from Israel on the Palestinian issue, but from the U.S., they want, as you mentioned, agreement for them to have a civil nuclear program, in other words, and in this case, to be allowed to enrich uranium. That's the problem. Nobody cares if they have real power reactors and they're under safeguards. The problem is that they want the right to enrich uranium, and they want a defense treaty with the U.S. They want essentially unlimited supply of American weapons. Of the three demands towards the U.S., the one that really concerns Israel is the one about enrichment. And we've always said that we don't object to Arab countries or Iran having a truly civil nuclear program, a power program. They, as a matter of fact, have a growing energy, believe it or not, a impending energy shortage because their populations are growing so rapidly. Pretty soon, they're going to have to, in about another decade, they're going to have to start importing refined crude, even as they continue to export as a source of income. So there is a justification, a logic for them to want nuclear power. Of course, they could go in to the renewable area, and the Saudis are also going there. Our concern is that a civil nuclear program, even something that starts off truly as a civil nuclear program, well, in the Middle East, they've always morphed into military programs, and that the Saudi case could also, and they've got the money to do it. I tend to think that what we can find kinds of international inspections as oversight. We can have American involvement in the program down to a level that will pretty much ensure that we know if the Saudis are trying to play games. Nothing in life is perfect. There's always a danger, but I think we can do that. What the U.S. has done, this is a decades-old policy. There's actually congressional legislation. It says that the U.S. will not support a nuclear program in any country if they want enrichment. That became the so-called, it's known as the gold standard. There's the 1, 2, 3 clause in congressional statute. And we say, by the way, Iran cannot be allowed to have enrichment. So why should we say that the Saudis should be allowed to have enrichment? Well, the Saudis have been an externally moderate state for most of their history. They don't threaten our destruction. And this is part of the deal here, is in exchange for making peace with us. And peace with Saudi Arabia it's the prize in the bag. I mean, it is the biggest achievement that we could have. Peace with Egypt was dramatic. Peace with the Abraham Accord states is dramatic. Saudi Arabia is the heart of the entire Muslim world, Shia and Sunni. Everybody prays towards Mecca. And if the Saudis make peace, then presumably not too far down the line, Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries will as well. So we have a great interest in doing this. And the question is, and I don't think there's an absolute answer, can we find sufficient safeguards to make it worthwhile? I think the answer is probably yes. And let me just make one final comment. We thought that we had solved the Iraqi nuclear issue because we bombed the reactor in 81, and then the US came and bombed and destroyed the reconstituted program in 93. And in 93, they really had a nuclear program. And then along comes the US in 2001, 2001 or 3. 2001 is the second Gulf War. Excuse me, the first Gulf War was 91, and then in 2003, the US comes along, and it turns out that they don't have a nuclear program. Well, they just announced that they are looking at reconstituting or rebuilding a civil nuclear program, and who knows what happens with that.
Yep, that's a very, very important point, something that I'm very disturbed to see, and I thank you for bringing that to everybody's attention. These problems don't go away. I think they get the
push down
if
the
you
line.
like, that push down the line, and they also get defanged for a period of time, or the poison is drawn out of them for a period of time. But yes, as long as there is toxicity towards the state of Israel, and by the way, as long as this region remains as unstable as it is, people are going to look for the ultimate security guarantee of their existence, and that is a nuclear weapon or an arsenal of nuclear weapons. Now, there's one thing that we're not going to discuss now, Chuck, just because of the limitations of time, but I want to try and bring us full circle, and perhaps we can discuss it in the future. The issue of a Saudi-Israel normalization or treaty, for that to be ratified, this is called the Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast. So let's talk a little bit about diplomacy. For that to be ratified in the United States of America, who are the brokers of this potential normalization, 2/3 of the Senate would have to vote in support of such a deal. And there would be, I believe, a pursuit by the Saudis to see an official treaty, precisely because the Iran deal was one that did not enjoy treaty status and that was withdrawn from by President Trump, it having been entered into by his predecessor, of course, President Obama. And so the Saudis will look at that and say, well, how secure is anything if not an official treaty? And I just want a short answer from you to this, really very short. I don't think that the Republicans will necessarily provide their support at this time and hand President Biden something that he could and surely would present as a massive foreign policy triumph, namely this normalization, given that we're heading into the US presidential election season. Because normalization, to your point, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, it would be no less historic than the Abraham Accords, which is a legacy. The Abraham Accords are a legacy issue, a legacy achievement on which the likely Republican nominee, like it or loathe it incidentally, which is Donald Trump at this stage, that legacy achievement of the Abraham Accords will surely be touted by Donald Trump as a differentiator between him and Joe Biden. Now, if Biden was to be given the support of 2/3 of the Senate and this treaty was to go forward in official fashion, it would not only provide him with an equally dramatic foreign policy achievement to that of President Trump, but it would also salve some of the foreign policy ineptitude that's still attached to Biden for the haphazard way in which the US withdrew from Afghanistan. So here you could see domestic politics blocking an international game changer. How do you see that playing out?
Well, first of all, once again, you're absolutely right. My understanding of what most of the assessments is that the problem, that the Republicans would actually support it because of the benefit to Israel, and that the real problem is from the Democratic side, and that the way to overcome the opposition from the liberal wing there is the concessions on the Palestinian issue. For example, Senator Van Walen has said explicitly that unless there's something significant on the Palestinian issue, he won't support it. And he was speaking for not, in essence, not just for himself, but for an entire group of senators. It's a hard sell, but it is a huge strategic breakthrough. And it's certainly worth trying. I don't know that this can be done before the elections. There's a lot to be negotiated between the U.S. and the Saudis on the Palestinian issue. And if the Saudis get even if it's not a formal defense treaty, but some other formal guarantee, binding guarantee, then Israel and other actors in the Middle East, whether it's UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, Jordan, will also want similar guarantees. So this is a huge move for the U.S. Each of these treaties would have, or agreements, requires very, very detailed professional discussions between the bureaucracies on both sides, between the defense establishments. The U.S. does not give security commitments to countries very easily. As a matter of fact, the last formal one was Japan in 1961. So I'm talking defense treaties. So the enthusiasm may be a little bit premature here, but because I believe it's such an important breakthrough, and since I do favor, unlike yourself, I do favor the attempt to making concessions to the Palestinians in return for concessions on their part, I do think it's a good thing for Israel, and we should try and pursue it.
Well, if the Republicans are propelled towards this because of its benefit to the state of Israel, if they can string this out for long enough, it'll still be a deal that they can make potentially under a Republican president and have it as a legacy issue again for a Republican president rather than a Democrat president. So we'll wait and see. Time will tell. And Chuck, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you as always. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for being so responsive to each and every point. Thank you for your candor and for your assessments, and for the, I love speaking to you because not only can you return a serve so ably, but you regularly serve aces towards me as well, which is something that I'm always the beneficiary of. So thanks a lot, Chuck. I look forward to the next time. And we'll speak very, very soon indeed. And people should be on the lookout for that interview of you about your book, Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power, that's going to be released by JBS in the coming days. Thanks a lot, Chuck.
Great. Thank you. It was great speaking to you as always, Benjamin.
Cheers.